Cool. Well, Randy, I do want to talk about some of the jigs that we throw because I do think that a lot of guys are probably curious about that. And let me transition over here to the jigs that we're fishing because we try not to talk about tackle like all the time because Randy talks about tackle on his YouTube channel a lot and everybody talks about tackle. There's like 15 tackle live streams, Randy, out there. So I like to talk about stuff other than tackle. But in terms of football or in terms of jigs go, really my go-to jig, as you guys probably know, is the Fish the Moment Offshore Jig by Jewel Bait. Designed this jig for Jewel. And the reason that I love this jig more than anything is twofold. The first is that it comes through brush and rock and cover better than any jig I've ever thrown. It has a double cable weed guard on it. It has this really nice head design that has a rock. It kind of rocks the jig out of cover. It has this double flat spot on it, and it has a unique fall with a double cable or a double keeper guard on it. So it falls a little bit different. It just comes through cover like crazy. And you've thrown these too, Randy. What are your thoughts on the jig coming through cover and stuff?
Oh, it's almost completely weedless. I mean, and that's the most difficult thing a lot of times when you're fishing a football head jig on deep brush, depending upon the limb diameter that you're fishing, is that jig will roll over the top of that limb and get caught up, and then you've ruined the whole pile. But the weed guard system on that jig is just I've never seen one that comes through brush as good as that does. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it's not just a double cable guard. It's the head with the eye position, the eye angle, everything. It's been designed perfectly to come through brush. And I go through like 2 jigs a month. And I throw this jig so much. You guys have seen that in a lot of my videos. I throw it a ton. And I go through like 2 of these a month. And you actually can get 2 of these. It's a 5/8 ounce jig for $6.99 on jewelbait.com. Only place you can get them. So you get 2 jigs for $6. Pretty solid deal. And while you're there, one thing just to make a shameless plug for the sponsors is check out on jewelbait.com the new Fish Tool subscription box. This is a new offering by Jewel Baits, and basically it is a subscription box that gives you $60 worth of premium American-made fishing tackle for $35. Another jig I like to throw a lot is the Jewel Bait Tactical Pro Spider Jig. So this is a little bit heavier jig that again has that double cable guard on it. And this jig doesn't come through brush quite as well as the Fish Moment Offshore jig because of the head design, but it still comes through pretty well. And it has a really nice hook on it that's a super sturdy hook. And I throw this jig a lot when I'm flipping up shallow, pitching shallow cover. I'm not showing my screen. Here's the jig here, Tactical Pro Spider Jig. And it has this double cable guard, really nice thick hook, and it has this finesse profile to it. So I'll throw this jig a lot when I'm flipping, casting it around, fishing in shallower water. And you can put it on heavy line. You can put it on like 15-pound test to 20-pound test, rip them. And it's actually designed to support the special ops survivors, so it's a really good cause too on that. So I love this jig. And one thing I like about it is it comes in that 7/16 ounce size, and that's actually the third myth that, or the not the third myth, the third mistake I see a lot of anglers make when they're jig fishing is they don't use a jig that's heavy enough. A lot of guys are throwing jigs that are as light as they can get away with. They say the lighter the jig, the better. But I actually find that for me, the heavier the jig I can get away with, the better. The more bites I get and the better bites I get. And if you look at the Fish the Moment Offshore jig, it's a 5/8 ounce jig, which actually isn't even as heavy as you could go. A lot of times I might throw a 3/4 or a 1 ounce jig, but the 5/8 is a good any time size that just kind of works in all situations. And that's really not that heavy a jig. I throw the 7/16 ounce finesse jig, which a lot of guys will throw a 3/16 or a 5/16 ounce. And the reason we go to these heavier jigs is I want to make sure that bait is maintaining contact with the bottom. It's in the cover, it's sitting down there, making contact with the cover. I don't want that jig to be floating around somewhere away from the cover. I want to make sure it gets down in there, stays in the cover. And honestly, I find that even like 40-degree water, super cold water, fish will eat my 5/8 ounce Fish Moment Offshore jig, no problem. When I was catching those 6 and 7 pounders out of brush piles a week ago, water temps were 43 degrees. Doesn't matter the cold weather. You don't need these super light jigs. Another jig I love to throw is the Jewel Bait Peewee football jig. This is basically a tiny jig that's like the size of a quarter. But the nice thing about it is that it comes in a pretty heavy size. You can throw a 7/16 ounce jig that's the size of a quarter. It's basically like a little ball of just straight lead. And these little jigs that are compact get a lot of bites, but because they're heavier, you can maintain bottom contact with them. And that's the biggest key with jig fishing, is keeping your bait on the bottom, feeling that bait through the presentation. So the heavier the jig you throw, usually the more consistent you're going to be in terms of keeping your bait around the cover and detecting the bites. Another jig I throw a lot is the Striking Hack Attack Heavy Cover Flipping Jig. And I'll throw this in like a 1 ounce or sometimes even a 1 1/4 ounce when I'm flipping even in like 2, 3, 4 foot of water, flooded bushes, heavy vegetation, and I catch a lot of fish on like a 3/4 ounce to a 1 1/4 ounce black and blue Hack Attack Heavy Cover Flipping Jig. So one thing I think the guys get scared away from with the jigs is they feel like the jig is too big or it's too heavy. But I find that a big profile bait, a heavier bait, it can get bit super well. And one great story I have is that I was fishing brush piles in Lake Dardanelle one summer in a night tournament. And my buddy was throwing a 10-inch worm, and I had a football jig on. And I was like, we were throwing around, and I broke off my Texas rig. We're throwing like a 3/16 ounce weight because the brush piles were in 5 or 6 foot of water, middle of the summer. And I broke off my Texas rig, and I picked up a 3/4 ounce football jig, fired in there, and caught a 4-pounder, fired back in there, caught a 5-pounder, throwing a 3/4 ounce jig in 5 foot of water on brush piles. So the heavy jig, big size doesn't really matter. Would you agree with all that, Randy?
Oh man, that's a topic right there that we could literally spend 8 hours talking about when you're talking about jig sizes, the rate of fall, and that type of stuff. But first of all, I'll say that I agree with you, Jonny, completely. That if you can get the bass to bite a heavy jig, you're so far ahead of everything because it's a lot more efficient. You can fish it in different water depths, different wind conditions. The bigger fish will usually bite the reaction of a heavy, fast-falling jig if you can get them to hit it. That being said, a lot of it just depends on the situation that you're in. I mean, we all know, what those situations are. It's water clarity, water temperature, the type of cover, the depth, the mood of the fish, that type of stuff. And another thing is your line size and your jig trailer is going to affect the fall of that jig completely too. And for me, it's about figuring out the rate of fall that fish wants that allows you to be most efficient. But like I said, if you can get those bass to bite a big heavy jig, most all the big bags of fish I've caught and the really big bass, like the 8 to 10 pound class fish that I've caught on a jig, have come on a 1/2 to 1 ounce jig. Although I fish them all different sizes. One of these days I'll have to break out my jig box here because I've got full profile jigs all the way from an 1/8 ounce up to an ounce. And you were talking about the spider jig a little bit. I want to give a little bit of story on that. That Jewel 9/16 ounce spider jig, the one that's got the wire hook. Do they still make it with the single wire weed guard?
It's a double wire now.
I've got about 100 of them. The single wire Jewel spider jig 9/16. That is the fish catchingest jig I have ever seen. If you need to cover deep water in a hurry. And for example, one of the things I like to do is I got onto it at Beaver Lake actually with this jig, covering a tremendous amount of water in that 15 to 20 foot zone around those deep cedar trees, just pitching and casting that 9/16 ounce spider jig around those trees. Super fast fall. It's a little compact jig. It falls like a rocket with a little bitty trailer on there, and they'll eat it up in clear water. And that's another thing that I have found is in clear water, they will bite that big, heavy, fast falling jig better than any other jig you can throw. In fact, it's almost a requirement. If you have water visibility of over 4 foot around any type of cover, I'm always fishing a big, heavy jig.
Yeah, and I've caught them even on Lake Dardanelle in lily pads in 3 foot of water, flipping a 1 ounce jig in the middle of the summer on lily pads, catching 5 and 6 pounders, just jacking them over the side of the boat. Pretty awesome. So I don't know. I'm really a big fan of going to a heavier jig, not always worrying about trying to downsize. If I'm going to downsize my bait, I'd rather go to a shaky head and Ned rig, something like that. I don't really see the need to downsize your jig as much. If I'm throwing a jig, I'm going for 5 to 10 bites a day. That is it, and just going after the big bites. Would you agree,
I
Randy?
think one of the things that I've learned a lot, because like I said, I've been a jig fishing fanatic for many, many decades. The thing that I've learned a lot about jig fishing has been from watching Greg Hackney.
Mm.
If you guys watch Greg Hackney, I love Hackney's style because there's an energy about Hackney that is tied into a jig. If you've ever watched him, he is like the most primal jig fisherman I've ever seen ever. And he's the one that got me throwing the 1 ounce jig a lot shallow, because before Hackney, a lot of people didn't do that. I remember years ago, Brent Chapman told me he was flipping a 3/4 ounce jig, and I like fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe he was flipping such a heavy jig. And now Hackney has got everybody flipping this 1 ounce jig in shallow cover, winning tournaments on it. And he's opened our eyes to the effectiveness of it. And I've even seen some of your videos, Jonny, when you were flipping the big jig and some of those shallow bushes and how effective it was. And we've all seen it and started adopting it more.
Yeah.
Most people don't equate flipping in 2 foot of water with a 1 ounce jig. It's like they consider it overkill. But the more we understand about bass personality, the behavior and the mood of bass, and the things that trigger bass to strike a lure, Hackney's opened my eyes to that big time.
I don't know if you'll be ashamed of me or shocked or what, Randy, but I have flipped a jig or any soft plastic I have flipped in the last 2 years. I've only flipped one bait, and that's a 1 ounce jig. Every single flipping fish I've caught in the last 2 years has been on that 1 ounce hack attack jig. I do not flip ever. I do not flip. I that's like not in my repertoire. I do offshore. Whenever I go up shallow, I just take a 1 ounce jig. And like the last time I did, I was cracking them, catching 3 and 4 pounders. But like I just don't flip hardly at all. And when I do, it's just a giant jig. I don't know. That's just a me thing.
Yeah, it's most of the time, like I said, that's the deal. There are exceptions to the rule. I can remember one of the best jig days I ever had in my life. It was on an FLW tournament at the Chaffalaya Basin in Louisiana, and I was flipping cypress trees. And I knew that those fish would bite a jig. Everything was set up just perfect for it. And I was tweaking and tweaking and tweaking and experimenting. And eventually what I did is I took a 1/4 ounce jig, a full lunker lure 1/4 ounce jig with a big, super chunk on it, a big giant profile jig. And I filed that 1/4 ounce head down to where it was like 1/8 of an ounce or even a 16th. And it just floated like a potato chip going down through the water. And I wound up almost winning that tournament on that little full-size 1/8 ounce jig. But that's an exception to the rule. Most of the time, those big ones want that heavy fast fall.
Awesome. And I do want to cover some jig trailers as well here, Randy. Before we do that,